Well, good evening and welcome to Nashville. I'm Alan Jackson. You know, history rarely changes because of speeches alone, because diplomacy, it only matters when it's backed up by the strength to enforce it. Well, that lesson feels especially relevant as NATO leaders gather and once again declare that Iran must never be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon. You know, it's a statement almost everyone can agree with, but declarations, well, they don't dismantle centrifuges, or press conferences don't deter a regime that has spent decades sponsoring terrorism, threatening Israel, and attacking American forces. President Trump, well, he arrived at the summit and met with leaders from Turkey, Syria, and Ukraine, and America's NATO allies. While Iran, well, they remain central to the conversation, but the alliance is also facing the staggering human cost of Russia's war in Ukraine. Estimates now place total deaths and serious injuries above 2 million people. Increasingly, global conflicts, they no longer look separate. Iran, Russia, and China, they may not share the same ideology in every detail, but they do share the common objective of weakening American leadership. Whether it's Beijing supplying economic lifelines and intelligence to Iran, or Tehran fueling terror across the Middle East, or Moscow trying to redraw Europe's borders, each regime benefits when the others succeed. Is the West demonstrating enough strength to preserve peace? Has Iran been weakened enough that they'll negotiate in good faith? And are we watching the rise of an authoritarian axis determined to reshape the world, while free nations argue over how seriously to take the threat? I think it's important that we maintain in our imagination that on a global scale, good and evil exist. Nations represent expressions of good and evil. I understand that beneath that level that it's a mixed bag. The reality is when the righteous thrive, the people rejoice. But when the wicked rule, the people groan. Iran has long declared its intent. Even at the recent funeral procession of the late Ayatollah, chants of death to Israel and death to America, they still rang out. Folks, that's not political rhetoric, that's a declaration of war. The United States stepped into a direct confrontation with Iran. You'd expect the NATO alliance, built on decades of shared defense, to show up in a meaningful way. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The media often frames the Iran war as an endless war or an unnecessary war started by President Trump. I disagree. Standing up to the terror regime in Iran, it's necessary. Evil must be confronted. Evil regimes, they don't stop on their own. The battle between Ukraine and Russia, it has to be seen differently as well. There are millions of people who have endured tremendous suffering and death. Elderly communities, pizza parlors, ice cream shops, entire cities in Ukraine have been leveled to rubble. Russian casualties, well, they're accelerating now in 2026. There's not a solution that's going to make everybody happy, but the bloodshed and the warfare, they have to stop. When I watched the 4th of July America 250 event at the National Mall, I felt President Trump helped redefine for our country who our real heroes are. His address focused on honoring the people who built, defended, and sacrificed for this nation across its history. Trump paid tribute to veterans from multiple generations. He invited them on stage, shared their stories of courage. A 104-year-old Pearl Harbor survivor was recognized for surviving the Japanese attack, just 19 years old. A 101-year-old veteran of the Battle of Iwo Jima was honored for his service during World War II. Our Korean veterans, they were recognized as well. Former astronaut Jack Schmitt, the last American to walk on the moon. The Artemis II flight crew, they were all honored as symbols of American exploration. 11 Gold Star families, those who'd lost a loved one in military service, were presented with American flags in recognition of their loved one's ultimate sacrifice. Standing before the first American flags ever produced, Trump honored the nation's founding heritage and praised the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence. He said they risked everything to secure America's freedom. He described the Founding Fathers as patriots who stepped onto the stage of destiny and achieved a victory for the ages. Trump concluded that the vision and courage of the founders, well, it laid the foundation for 250 years of American strength, freedom, and prosperity. Now, it's our turn in the arena. Expressions of American strength must continue, or we will leave our young people and the generations that follow us vulnerable. The more vulnerable we are, the more battles we're engaged in. It would be naive to think that what happens globally doesn't affect us internally, in the communities and neighborhoods in which we each one live. Let's continue to pray for America and our leadership. Let's pray that God would bless America, that Judeo-Christian principles will continue to flourish in our nation. And as President Ronald Reagan described it, that America would be the shining city on a hill. Well, in a moment, joining us will be Mary Kissel. She's the former senior advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. I'll be right back.
This year, we celebrate 250 years of God's faithfulness to our nation. From backyard picnics and ball games to laughter shared with family and friends, we've been given so many blessings to enjoy together. And in a world that feels increasingly divided, these moments remind us of what matters most: faith, freedom, family, and community. Alan Jackson Ministries wants to help you carry that message with you wherever you may go. This outdoor blanket and canvas tote bag are simple reminders of God's goodness and a way to spark meaningful conversations about faith and the hope we have in Him. Request your limited edition tote bag and outdoor blanket today with your gift of $100 or more at alanjackson.com or call 800-880-5102.
Tonight, we're joined by foreign policy expert Mary Kissel. Welcome to our show, Mary.
Thank you so much for having me.
We have just come off a weekend where the Iran negotiations were put on hold so they could hold a state funeral for their former supreme leader. What are your thoughts on these latest negotiations?
Well, I think it's important to put these negotiations into context. We've had multiple presidential administrations try to talk with Tehran to no good end because of the nature of the regime. It is a revolutionary Islamist regime that is bent on ejecting American influence from the Middle East and eliminating the state of Israel. And there's no indication that that has changed. But secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, today Tehran has very powerful partners in Moscow and in Beijing. And so I think the way that we frame these discussions is often as a bilateral discussion, when in reality, it's not a bilateral issue at all. It's really a Russia, China, Iran bloc against Israel, the United States, and other freedom-loving nations. And that's an important difference than it was, say, during the Bush era, when the Europeans were leading negotiations, or even during the Obama era with that obviously, tainted and failure of a nuclear deal. And I fear, Pastor, that we're probably going to have to return to some significant kinetic action or engage in some sort of appeasement that, again, we know has failed in the past.
No, I think your point is so well taken that these negotiations are not with just the single nation of Iran. China and Russia are very much, not just in the backdrop, but I think engaged. Is that why Iran can be so recalcitrant? Even in spite of all the damage they've taken, they don't seem particularly willing to yield on any points.
Well, you have different kinds of brutal regimes, right? You have brutal regimes that can be bought off, like in the case of the Maduro regime. They're basically just a criminal organization. And then you have deeply ideological regimes like Communist China and today's Islamic Republic of Iran, where you have some true believers. These are paranoid regimes. The people of Iran don't want them there anymore. I think the Iranian people have, seen through this facade of revolutionary zeal. They see the regime for what it is. They're suffering greatly under it. And so you have a leadership that is paranoid, in many cases has an ideological bent to keep fighting at any cost. And now, of course, yes, they have supporters in China buying their oil and in good, willing customers in Russia to buy their drones and other military equipment. And so they feel like they can hang on, and they see that we're a democratic republic, that we have political forces here in the United States that might make it difficult for President Trump to take the kind of action that he wants to take because he doesn't want to suffer the political consequences here at home. So they're making a calculation that they can just hold on long enough until the president is out of office, or coerce him into some sort of appeasement deal like the one signed under President Obama.
You know, in the past months, I've talked to a number of Iranian professionals in America that were holding tightly to the hope that the people there would respond given the opportunity. When we saw the crowds that were a part of that funeral celebration for the Supreme Leader this weekend, it seemed like there's overwhelming support for the regime. Is that for the camera or is that an actual reality?
Well, that's for the camera. I mean, that's like when you see Xi Jinping walk into the Great Hall and everybody stands up and claps like it's North Korea. Now, that being said, I'm sure there are some enthusiastic supporters who are involved in the corruption regime and profiting off the backs of the Iranian people, particularly the senior leadership of the IRGC. But the only time that you actually get to see what the Iranian people truly think is when they get out into the streets and protest. Same is true in China. The same is true in every other authoritarian regime. You can't do polling that's accurate. The only time you really understand what people want is when they have the courage to get out into the streets and protest. Remember, too, that there are lots of different kinds of Iranians. You have Persians, Baluchis, Azeris, Kurds, right? It's a nation of many ethnicities, but the one thing that binds them together is their suffering at the hands of this incredibly corrupt, incompetent regime, which is resulting in water shortages, hyperinflation, economic distress, death, right? They've killed tens of thousands of their own citizens. And we can't forget that. And we're very bad at knowing when people are going to get out and kind of reach the limit, right? Where it gets so bad that they will risk life and limb to overturn a regime. We missed the Iranian protests in the Obama era. We missed the Arab Spring. We didn't predict the fall of the Soviet Union. We're really bad at knowing when these very opaque, corrupt regimes are going to crumble. And that's why it's so important that we continue to support freedom, and we continue to say very clearly that we hope that these people enjoy the same freedoms that we enjoy. We have to always say that. Otherwise, we don't take the moral high ground here, which is ours to have, then we become just like any other nation pursuing our national interests.
Well, I think your observations are so important. The regime change idea is so incredibly difficult, and we've got a lot of experience with that, and yet we see the need for new leadership. So I guess the question is, what's the best way to support the people that allows that spark of hope to stay alive in them so they can move towards a better destiny for themselves?
Well, the first thing we can do is stop the moral equivalency. I really cringe when I hear the president say, well, yeah, China's done bad things, but we've done bad things too. Well, no, our systems are incredibly different. Just like the Islamic Republic's system of governance is morally inferior to ours. We have to stand up and be unafraid to say that, first and foremost. Secondly, we need to speak directly to the Iranian people over the heads of the leadership, like Reagan used to do to the Soviets. Speak directly to them. I'm not advocating that we need some sort of ground invasion or that we're going to democratize Iran. We don't need to do that. We know the Iranian people don't want this regime based on what they've done, protesting almost continuously for more than a decade now. But we can support them in many ways. We can support them by returning to the maximum pressure campaign. We can rally our allies to help support us in that effort. We can impose secondary sanctions on communist China so that any Chinese banking entity in Hong Kong in particular that does business with the regime is also sanctioned. We can encourage our friends in places like Australia to help us patrol the strait. There are any number of things that we can do to support this regime. The Starlink effort to allow the Iranian people to communicate with each other, extremely important. And we can support the state of Israel and be more understanding to the strategic situation that they're facing, where they're looking to their east and saying, here's a regime that has potential nuclear capacity pretty quickly here that wants to destroy us. And instead of undermining them, we need to support them, support their efforts to eliminate Iran's proxies around the region, and then go to places like Saudi Arabia and say, look, we're on your side. You don't need to go make a deal with Tehran because we're here standing with you. And we want peace and prosperity in this region. And you know as well as we do that we're not going to have it while this regime stays in place. So quite a wide range of things there, Pastor, that can be done. And it doesn't have to be, appeasement or war. There's quite a number of options in between.
Well, Mary, we need to take a short break. Will you stand by for another segment?
Sure, happy to.
And for those of you watching, if you've got a phone nearby, you can log on to ajnow.com, send me an email. We'd like to hear your thoughts on this topic. We'll be right back. We're back now with Mary Kissel, foreign policy expert from the Hudson Institute. Mary, a recent poll has shown that young Americans are much less likely than the older generations to see China as a major threat to the United States. Now, despite that generational divide, concern about China remains high nationally. The fentanyl that flows into our country, largely through their support and sponsorship. How do we help the younger generations of Americans understand what China represents to our future?
Well, I think it starts with telling the truth about the nature of the regime in Beijing, how they talk to their people about us, and to just look at the facts of the kind of military they're building, what they've done as they have built it, and how Xi Jinping is talking about how he's going to use that military in the future. I mean, here you have a totalitarian regime. It's committing genocide, which we, have essentially ignored and not talked much about in the last couple of years, which I find absolutely astounding. And it has built the world's it's got a 1 million-man army. It has the world's largest navy. I believe it's the third largest air force. It's aiming to have hundreds of nuclear weapons, biological, chemical weapons programs. It's attacking our satellites every day. Not to mention the brutality at home, it also has designs on its neighbors. It's deeply infiltrated the United States. So how do we educate our young people? We do that by using the platforms, starting with the federal government, the White House, the Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and just laying out the facts of what we're seeing, what they're saying, and how it pertains to us. And, that we did a lot of that in Trump 1 when I worked for Secretary Pompeo. It wasn't a partisan issue. We tried very hard, actually, to keep it nonpartisan because it's an American issue. And this is a threat that is different from every other threat that we've ever faced because we're so integrated with their economy and because we're such an open society. They've been able to infiltrate us deeply here at home in a way that the Soviets could only have dreamed of.
Well, the NATO leaders are gathered this week. The NATO chief, Mark Rutte, had made this comment. I want you to hear it, and then I want to ask a question.
I strongly believe that the NATO we had only 3 or 4 years ago, going forward, would not have been sustainable. Over-reliant on the United States, Europe not spending enough, not producing enough.
So what can we realistically expect to come out of this summit?
Well, I think the Secretary General is right that NATO's trajectory was unsustainable. What he didn't say in that clip is that we actually have some NATO members spending more as a percent of their GDP on defense than we do. So some of the spending increases, particularly on the eastern flank, have been quite significant. What I hope we get coming out of this summit is a renewed commitment to spend more on behalf of our European allies, a reassertion of the U.S. interest in supporting NATO, which I believe President Trump does very strongly. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been having these conversations. A reexamination of China's influence in the region as a destabilizing force alongside Russia and Iran. And I would hope someday to see the Europeans realize that it's in their interest to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. And yes, sometimes they need to cooperate with a Washington whose politics they don't share. At the end of the day, NATO has taken on a new vigor and a new purpose because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine with Russian and with Chinese and Iranian support. And what you're seeing is an organization that is rising to meet those threats, trying to reconstitute itself, and really also trying to muster the political will at home because they've built such huge welfare states, they have such sclerotic economies. They're going to have to make some tough political choices if they value their safety and security in the future.
Many of our European allies have a significantly increased Islamic influence. Do you think that was a part of the reticence we saw in their participation in our conflict with Iran?
No.
So they're just stubborn and didn't want to be a part of it?
Well, look at the approval ratings of President Trump in a place like the UK. where you had, at the time of the beginning of the conflict, a prime minister who was way over his head, Keir Starmer, deeply unpopular, no policy direction. There are many reasons why Keir Starmer wasn't interested in cooperating, not to mention the fact that I'm not sure he really grasped or had the political mettle to take on the question of European security. That's why you saw his defense secretary resign and other senior military figures, and why they have a new prime minister today. And they will likely have a different government after the next election. Spain, again, deeply unpopular, allegedly corrupt prime minister in Sanchez. More interested in propping up his own political fortunes at home to try to hold on as long as he can before the parties of the right sweep into power, which I believe they will do soon. And so I think, we get often caught up in, one aspect or one way of looking at a conflict, but when you have to think about it from their point of view, what are their interests and what are the political calculations that these European leaders are making, and why, from their point of view, are they doing it?
Well, Mary, thank you for your time today. Your insights are helpful. They bring clarity to some things that are often confusing.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, in a moment, we'll be back with your emails. Thank you for spending a few moments of your day with us. I know you're busy. Your time is precious. Just a reminder, if you ever miss a live episode, you can always go to ajnow.com. There's a full archive there of all the broadcasts. You can watch them at your leisure. They're easy to share with a friend. Thank you for your emails. We're always intrigued by your thoughts and comments. Lupe wrote in. She said, my sister and her husband are like a lot of disengaged Christians. They believe this world isn't their home, which is true, and that Jesus will return to make things right anyway. Therefore, they see no reason to get involved. That's their stance. I try to tell them that their vote and involvement will make a difference, but I can't seem to get through to them what to do. Well, I'd start with prayer. Prayer changes things more than anything I know, but the reality is Jesus told us to be salt and light, not just to find a bunker and wait for the trumpet to blow. And salt in the shaker, it's useless. So pray that God will open their hearts, give them a revelation of His purpose and plan for their lives in this season of history. When the Lord returns, I want Him to find us busy about His purposes, not just waiting to see Him. Dennis from Florida wrote, we need term limits for all elected senators and congressmen. Congressmen need to have an office in their district. They need to stay in their home district 51 weeks a year. That way we can pound on their desk and say, listen to us. They can vote using a secure computer system. Well, Dennis, I think term limits are a good idea, but if you pound on their desk 51 weeks a year, they're not staying in the office, I promise. Folks, God's moving in the earth. Let's decide to be a part. Thank you for a few moments of your time today. God bless.